Hello DCP110 students. Today I will show you how to construct a small scale partial fleece sleeve with a ribbed cuff. There are two pattern pieces for this sample. The first one will be cut out of fleece. You will cut one of these and it has a single notch at the bottom which denotes the middle of the wrist on the outside away from the side seam. Please mind the grain of this piece. The grain on fleece will run with the grain of this sample. This is the second pattern piece for this sample. It is cut out of ribbing. Ribbing also has a grain, and the grain is denoted here. This particular piece has 4 notches. Please notch very carefully because ribbing has a tendency to run with deep notches, so very, very tiny clips for notches, and you're going to cut one from ribbing. These are the fabrics that I will be using for the small sample of a fleece partial sleeve with a ribbed cuff. This is ribbing. Ribbing, as you can see, looks quite different from regular fabric. It has vertically spaced ribs, and the grain runs with the ribs. The stretchability of the ribbing is determined across the grain. It has great stretch and recovery. It is partially made of lycra. Please mind the grain when you cut the piece for the cuff. This is fleece that I'm going to use for the sleeve part. It also has grain. The grain runs with the selvage of fleece. Do you see it's not very stretchy, and it's much stretchier across the grain. So please mind the grain on both the ribbing and the fleece for this project. I have cut out a single one of the fleece sample and a single one out of the ribbing. I will show you how to notch fabrics that are likely to produce large holes if you're not careful with marking notches. I'm taking just the very tip of my scissor and just with the very tip marking the center at the wrist level as indicated on a pattern. Very, very small. I'm going to say it's even less than 1/4 of an inch. And now I'm going to mark ribbing. Ribbing requires 4 notches. Again, very, very small notches because ribbing has a tendency to run when notches are clipped deeper than this. So I'm going to say between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch. Very, very small cut, just with the tip of your scissor. I have notched my pattern pieces. This one has a single notch, this one has 4 notches, and now we're ready to sew. I am now ready to sew the fleece part of my sample. I am folding it good sides together along the seam line, which runs along the grain line. The seam allowance in this case is 1/4 of an inch. Because this is a spongy and thick fabric, I'm going to use a generous 1/4 of an inch. That means maybe a 1/16 of an inch bigger than 1/4 of an inch to allow the sewing machine foot to glide seamlessly along the fabric. So the stitch length in this case is 3.0. I am backstitching in the beginning and proceed to sew to the edge of my seam. I'm at the opposite edge of my seam and I am going to backstitch. And cut the thread. And now I am ready to serge the edge. So as we discussed in prior classes, almost all knit edges are serged together. I want to show you what the fleece part of the sample looks now. I have sewn and serged the seam of the sleeve, and this sample now will be laid aside, and I'm going to continue working on the ribbing. To sew the ribbing, lay it good sides together in this fashion. I have just folded it in half. This is the good side of my ribbing. I am folding it together along the grain. So what you're looking at right now, do you see how this piece became long? Your ribs should be running with the seam, okay? we have 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am using a 3.0 stitch length, and I'm going to put a pin. Do you see we have a notch right here? We have a notch right here. I think you can see it along my finger. And I'm going to put a pin right there because ribbing sometimes has a tendency to slip away and push the sewing machine foot to the side. So I'm just securing it at this notch. So again, your sample should look long and your ribs are running this way, this is the seam we're going to sew, and we are running along the length of the ribs. 3.0 seam allowance, 1/4 inch, 3.0 stitch length, 1/4 inch seam allowance. I am back stitching at the beginning, and now with the 1/4 inch seam allowance, continue to stitch to the end. I just back stitched at the end as well. I'm just going to trim all the thread. And once again, please check that the ribs of the ribbing are running in the same direction as the seam. Your sample now looks like this. I am going to lay it in such a way that the seam is looking up. Do you see the seam is in the middle? Open up the seam allowance, just like this with your fingers. There's no need to press it, okay? And we're going to turn it seam allowances face to face. So you are folding wrong sides together. Do you see? Your seam allowance is open. I'm holding it, and the entire little cuff is going to be folded with wrong sides on the inside, and seam allowances open like this. I just want to adjust it. The reason I'm holding seam allowances open is because I'm trying to avoid any accumulation of bulky fabric on the inside. So the cuff now looks like this. This is the seam. This is the good side. It is folded with seam allowances facing each other together. All the seam allowances are open. You can feel it, just like that. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to lay stay stitching or permanent basting, as we discussed before, along the raw edge. It goes along the raw edge. The reason I want to do this is because I want to make sure that the raw edges don't come apart and slip when I attach them to the fleece part of the sleeve. So because this is such a tiny opening, I'm going to show you how I sew these on the machine without a floating arm. This machine has one, but I think it's useful for you to know in case you do not have a machine with a floating arm, such as an industrial machine. So to slide the small opening of the sample onto your foot, you're going to turn it with the seam allowance to the outside like this. Do you see what I did? It was like this. And I'm turning it this way, sort of making it stand up like this. And this allows me to put the seam allowance flat, like this, under my sewing machine foot. I am going to allow the feed dogs to control the stretchability of the seam allowance, because I don't want to remove all of it. It's useful to have it stretch around the wrist. But I don't want to force it to be too stretched or too not stretched. Just allow the feed dogs to do their work. So right now I'm going to move the camera slightly so hopefully you can see better. Do you see that? I'm using 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew a line of stay stitching or permanent basting. And I'm allowing the feed dogs to do their work. I'm not even back stitching, 3.0 stitch length. This is just to hold the raw edges together before I put them onto the cuff. And you will see the other notches that were not used. Here they are. Here's one layer, here's the other layer. When you're sewing this correctly, the two notches will match. I'm not stretching, I'm simply holding the raw edges together. And I'm not back stitching at the beginning or the end. I will show you what this looks like now. So now the sample looks like this. This is the edge that I just stitched. Do you see that? I was not stretching it. It has some flexibility. Do you see how the flexibility is still there? Because I allowed the feed dogs to create however much stretch or the non-stretch that the fabric required. Okay, so now this is ready to go and be attached to the fleece part of the sleeve. Now I'm going to sew the ribbed cuff to the fleece part of the sleeve. I am going to take the sleeve, which right now is wrong side out, and I will turn it good side out like this. If you are not sure which part is the top of the sample and which part is the wrist, do you remember we cut a notch at the wrist? So if you find that little notch, it's right here. Right here, I'm going to try to put it on the machine. You will see it better, I think. This is the little notch that I cut before right there. This is the wrist part. So I am laying it in such a way that I'm looking at the seam. Now I'm going to grab my ribbed cuff and I am going to thread it onto the sleeve with the folded part away from the wrist. So to do that, I'm going to put my hand inside the sleeve like this, and now I am going to hold it while I'm threading the cuff on top, and I am going to try and match the seam of the sleeve with the seam of the cuff, so they look like this. Do you see this? This is the raw edge. This is the raw edge of the sleeve. This is the raw edge of the cuff, and they're matched together. The sleeve is turned good side out. Do you see that? You can see the seam of the sleeve. It's finished. And I'm matching the sleeve seam to the cuff seam. And I'm going to put a pin. They matched raw edges together. I'm putting a pin to connect the seam to the seam of the cuff to the seam of the sleeve. And it doesn't matter which way the seam allowance of the sleeve goes. It is serged together, so right or left, it doesn't matter. And then I'm going to rotate. You see I'm rotating it? This is the pin that's holding the seams together. I'm going to rotate it until I find the wrist notches. Do you see? This is the wrist notch of my cuff, and it's going to be connected with the wrist notch of my sleeve. Another pin to secure the centers of the cuff and sleeve together. So now it looks like this. Do you see how there's a lot more sleeve? The circumference of the wrist part of the sleeve is quite a bit wider than the circumference of the cuff. And this is where the stretch of the and recovery of the cuff is going to come in handy. What I'm going to do when I sew it, I'm going to stretch. Do you see that? I am stretching the ribbed cuff to make the sleeve fit inside. And so I don't need any more pins. This is a very small distance to sew. I'm going to first turn it this way just like we did before, to allow me to put my seam allowance under the sewing machine foot. I'm going to sew with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. The reason this is 3/8 and not a 1/4 of an inch is because this will be a stressed seam, because the hand is going to go through the sleeve and stretch it, and it has to recover, and so we like to give it a little bit more seam allowance to make it a strong connection, a strong seam. So what I'm doing now is I'm now stretching. Do you see? I am stretching, sorry, I just bumped the camera. What I'm doing is I'm stretching the cuff from pin to pin. I'm sewing with a 3.0 seam allowance, sorry, stitch length, and 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I just back stitched at the beginning, and I'm just matching raw edges and stretching the cuff to fit the longer length of the opening of the sleeve. Okay, I'm stopping and starting to give myself a better control of the fabric. So we no longer have to worry about the raw edges of the cuff slipping away from us, because we know that they're joined together with stay stitching or permanent basting. Okay, so we are now at the center point, at the notch point of both cuff and sleeve. Okay, I'm now past the middle portion, and I'm continuing to stretch the ribbed cuff to match the longer opening of the sleeve. And if you remember, the cuff has a great stretchability and recovery because it has Lycra in it. That's why we use ribbing. And I just backstitched at the end. I am going to cut the thread and show you what this looks like. Just trimming all the loose threads. And so now, before it's turned, they look like this. And when you flip it down, it looks something like this. The seam of the cuff is very close to the seam of the sleeve, and the rest of it just looks like a regular cuff. Hopefully you can see that. I will now put my hand through so you can see what this looks like. Looks like this. I think it might be easier for you to see on my hand. Do you see? The cuff fits snugly around the wrist. The seams are underneath and matching, and it looks like this. So I'm going to take it off, turn it wrong side out now, because what I need to do now is I need to serge this edge. All of this has to be serged together. You see, the entire opening that we have just sewn will be serged together. I now finished serging the sample, and it is complete. I want you to see what the inside looks like. I used the same technique on the serger of turning this out and feeding this turned edge under the serger. I have not cut anything off. The sample looks neat and tidy. Everything is finished, and when you flip the cuff down, it looks like this on the wrong side, and the cuff on the inside is completely finished. And when I turn it to the right side, you'll see that the sample looks like a completed partial sleeve. Do you see that? You do not need to serge the top part. The sample is now ready.